The name America is spoken with such casual certainty that its origin seems settled, immutable, and obvious. Most are taught it comes from the Latinized name of Amerigo Vespucci, the Florentine navigator who helped reveal the outlines of a so-called New World to the consciousness of Europe. And yet there lingers, beneath layers of official history and scholarly consensus, a whisper, a quieter current, a suggestion that the word America may not have been bestowed but remembered. Not imported from Europe but reawakened from the continent itself. The whisper says that long before ships carved through Atlantic waves, long before parchment maps imagined blank spaces as realms of conquest, the land already had a name. Amaruca, the land of the Plumed Serpent. It is a claim that sounds mythic, and perhaps it is. But myth does not mean falsehood. Myth means memory wrapped in symbol. And symbols have their own truths, ones not measured in carbon dating or footnotes, but in resonance, the way a word pulls something ancient from the bones. To follow this whisper, one must walk not through battlefields or capitals, but through glyphs, cosmologies, oral traditions, and serpentine temples that seem to breathe in stone. In the esoteric teachings echoed by philosopher-mystic Manly P. Hall, Amaruca was a name known to the secret schools of wisdom long before Columbus sailed or Vespucci wrote his letters. In these teachings, America was not just a place but a prophecy, a vessel for ancient knowledge, a land destined to hold the sleeping wisdom of a forgotten time, waiting to be reawakened when the stars turned once more. This Amaruca is not mentioned in textbooks. It rarely appears in academic journals. But it lives, half forgotten, half imagined, in the myths of Mesoamerica and the Andes. It flickers in the names of gods who wore feathers and serpents like mantles of meaning. Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, Gucumatz, Viracocha. These are not mere deities but archetypes, figures who descended not to be worshipped but to teach. Civilizers, bringers of order, wisdom, and science. They walked not in lightning and fire but in maze and starlight. They shaped calendars, instructed kings, aligned pyramids to solstices, and taught people to live in harmony with the turning of the earth. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent of the Aztecs, was said to have emerged from the east, born of a virgin clothed in humility. He rejected sacrifice, taught the sacredness of breath, and departed across the sea, promising to return. Kukulkan, the Maya version, was not just a god but a force, a weaving of serpent and bird, earth and sky, body and spirit. Gucumatz, among the Kich Maya, brought language, fire, and knowledge. Viracocha, in the high Andes, formed humanity from stone and taught compassion before walking into the ocean, vanishing into the horizon. And Amaru, the sacred serpent of the Andes, was not feared but revered. Where in Europe the serpent slithered as tempter and threat, in the indigenous Americas it coiled as teacher and transformer. The Amaru was the force of change, the energy that tunnels through earth, that breaks skin so one may shed the old. If one listens carefully, these serpent gods echo across the continent, not as scattered legends but as fragments of a unified mythos. A map drawn in symbols, not borders. Could it be, then, that the name America hides within it the name Amaru? That beneath Vespucci's Latinization lies a more ancient memory? The idea is not new, though it has remained on the margins. Scholars of alternative history, mystics, and indigenous storytellers have pointed out that the word Amaruca appears in certain pre-Columbian traditions, especially among Andean cultures. They suggest that the land itself was once known in sacred speech as the place of the serpent, the domain of hidden wisdom. In some Andean texts, Amaruca is invoked in reference to the great underground rivers of knowledge, the currents of energy said to run beneath sacred sites. These sites, aligned with stars and serpent lines, formed a lattice of wisdom that connected the continent from north to south, from Teotihuacan to Tiwanaku, from Cahokia to Carol. The name Amaruca, they say, may have traveled orally across centuries, never written until Europeans arrived, but known in the bones of priests, in the chants of elders, and in the names of gods who always bore feathers and fangs. Manly P. Hall, writing in the early 20th century, echoed this theory. He claimed that the name America derived from a distortion of Amaruca, the land dedicated to the plumed serpent. He saw in the founding of the United States not merely a political revolution, but a spiritual experiment, one seeded by mystics, Freemasons, and hidden adepts who believed the Western Hemisphere was destined to become the cradle of a new cycle of human awakening. Hall believed that certain founding fathers, particularly those steeped in Freemasonry, carried secret knowledge of these ancient truths, that their architecture, symbols, and ideals were shaped not only by Enlightenment rationalism, but by esoteric traditions that predated Europe's modern era. The Great Seal of the United States, the unfinished pyramid, the Eye of Providence, these, he suggested, were not simply emblems of a new republic, but echoes of a more ancient order, one that remembered the sacred geometry of the Maya, the serpent symbology of the Olmecs, and the star maps of the Anasazi. Could such connections be coincidence? Perhaps. But coincidence, like myth, is not always proof of absence. The serpent, after all, was a central motif across the indigenous Americas, not as evil but as wise, as creative, as the binder between worlds. In the southeastern United States, the Mississippian culture left behind great earthen mounds in the shape of serpents, most famously the Serpent Mound of Ohio, whose curves align with celestial events. No one knows exactly who built it. The stars know. The earth remembers. In the southwest, the Hopi people speak of Palyulukan, the horned water serpent, guardian of springs and rains. In the jungles of the Yucatan, stone steps rise in silence, once echoing with chants to Kukulkan, whose descent on the equinox still plays in light and shadow upon the pyramid at Chichen Itza. These are not isolated symbols. They are a language, a forgotten tongue written in feather and scale, in sun and stone. To name a land America then may be to echo Amaruca without knowing it. A slip of tongue, a sliver of memory, a seed planted in error but sprouting into meaning. And so we are left with questions. Was America named after a Florentine merchant? Or was that just the surface story? Is it possible that Vespucci's name, while historical, was chosen, elevated, remembered, precisely because it rhymed with something older, deeper, mythic? We may never know with certainty. But the land speaks in symbols. And the serpents still coil through its myths, through its rivers, its monuments, and its names. They whisper. They flicker in dreams. They wait. And perhaps in listening, not to textbooks but to temples, to myth, to the rhythm beneath recorded time, we may begin to hear them again. Would you like me to continue with Section 2? where we explore the serpent's symbology across cultures of the Americas, focusing on Mesoamerican myths and their deeper esoteric meanings. To understand the plumed serpent as more than myth, one must travel backward, not just through time but through language, stone, and symbol. Among the peoples of ancient Mesoamerica, stories were not merely entertainment or religious tools. They were maps of meaning. Sacred architecture, celestial calendars, and oral chants did not merely describe the gods. They embodied them. And of all the symbols that repeated, coiled, and returned, none was more central than the serpent. And not just any serpent, but one adorned with feathers raised from the earth, elevated to the sky. In the Valley of Mexico around the first millennium CE, the great city of Teotihuacan flourished. It was not built by the Aztecs but long before them. The city's name, given later by the Nahua, means the place where men become gods. Its broad avenues and towering pyramids still speak in stone, though no one knows what language its builders once spoke. At the heart of Teotihuacan stands the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, the third largest pyramid of the complex. Its facade is covered in repeating images of plumed serpent heads emerging from stylized waves. The serpent here is not slithering but emerging, rising. Surrounding it are masks, glyphs, and carved symbols believed to represent Tlaloc, the rain god, and possible cosmological forces. What does this structure say if one listens without prejudice? It does not scream of conquest or domination. It does not raise a sword. Instead, it sings of transformation, rhythm, and return. The serpent, creature of the ground, is given wings. And in doing so it ascends, not to conquer the sky but to unify it with the earth. This merging of above and below repeats across the Mesoamerican world. In the later Toltec and Aztec civilizations, the deity Quetzalcoatl emerges not as a war god, but a cultural founder. His name, composed of Quetzal, precious green feathers, and Coatl, serpent, captures his dual nature. He is both beautiful and grounded, sacred and serpentine. Quetzalcoatl, according to Nahuatl traditions, brought maize to the people. He created humanity from the bones of past worlds, retrieved from the underworld with cunning and sacrifice. He taught the measurement of time, the arts of building, of agriculture, of ethics. He opposed human sacrifice and was sometimes exiled for his compassion. In some versions he was tricked by other gods into a shameful act and left, sailing eastward across the sea, vowing to return one day. There is no final version of his story. Each community told it differently, colored by its own sky. But always the themes held: descent, sacrifice, wisdom, and eventual return. To the Maya of the southern lowlands, the same deity was known as Kukulkan. The pyramid of Kukulkan in Chichen Itza is not only an architectural wonder, but a living calendar. With 91 steps on each of its 4 sides, plus the summit platform, it forms 365 steps, one for each day of the solar year. Twice a year, during the equinoxes, light and shadow align so precisely that the serpent's body appears to slither down the northern stairway, culminating in the sculpted serpent head at the base. This is not accidental. This is instruction, stone turned into celestial dialogue. The pyramid doesn't just mark time, it performs it. But what was the serpent telling? What did Kukulkan mean to those who built such a monument? Among the classic Maya, Kukulkan was a bringer of knowledge. associated with vision, prophecy, and the cycles of renewal. The serpent was not just animal, it was energy, the path through which sacred knowledge flowed. Often, serpents were depicted as portals, with human heads emerging from their jaws as if to suggest that thought or soul was being born from serpent wisdom. In Maya cosmology, the Milky Way itself was sometimes imagined as a great sky serpent. At night, the gods traveled along its winding spine. Dreams were journeys along that celestial back. The shaman, lying still in trance, rode that path, not metaphorically but ritually. And so, the serpent was not simply a creature of the earth, but the very shape of sacred travel. Further south, among the highland Kich Maya of present-day Guatemala, the name Gucumatz appears, a feathered serpent deity who participated in the creation of the world. In the Popol Vuh, one of the most sacred and poetic accounts of Maya mythology, Gucumatz and his divine counterpart Tepu form humans out of maize after earlier, failed attempts with mud and wood. Maize is not just a crop. It is human flesh. It is memory. It is lineage. Gucumatz, like Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl, represents the principle of divine intelligence manifesting through form. And yet he too is described in gentle terms. He does not hurl lightning or demand offerings of blood. He brings balance, coherence, vision. He is knowledge given shape. In every case, the plumed serpent is not an object of fear. It is a guide, a mentor, a being who descends, not to rule but to teach, who rises, not to flee but to return. Even in conflict, these deities teach. The Aztecs, whose empire absorbed and inherited the symbols of earlier cultures, preserved tales of Quetzalcoatl's departure as both a loss and a hope. Some scholars argue that when Hernán Cortés arrived in the early 1500s, the timing coincided with Quetzalcoatl's prophesied return, and that Moctezuma may have hesitated out of reverence or confusion. Whether true or mythologized later by Spaniards, it illustrates how deeply these figures were embedded in cultural consciousness. But why serpents? Why feathers? In symbolic terms, the serpent represents the earth. Motion, change, renewal. It sheds its skin. It coils and moves in silence. It hides then strikes. In ancient symbology, it is life beneath the surface. Feathers, by contrast, represent the sky, flight, vision, transcendence. The birds whose plumes were used in rituals were seen as messengers between realms. To place feathers on a serpent is to harmonize opposites. Earth and air. Instinct and intellect. The plumed serpent is not a hybrid but a unifier. A teaching that wisdom must arise from both rootedness and aspiration. In Mesoamerican philosophy, duality is not contradiction. It is harmony. The gods often had twin aspects, male and female, light and shadow, death and rebirth. The serpent was both feared and revered. Rain was both gift and danger. Life required balance, and the serpent gods taught that lesson through their very form. Could it be, then, that the story of the plumed serpent is more than religious mythology? That it is a kind of ancient pedagogy, an encoded curriculum of consciousness? A way to teach, through form and ritual, the inner architecture of awakening? Modern interpreters, especially those in esoteric and comparative philosophy, believe so. They suggest that Quetzalcoatl and his kin were not gods in the sense of deities to be worshipped, but enlightened beings, avatars, sages, or archetypes who left behind a legacy of inner science. Their teachings were not commandments, but reminders. Their stories were not dogma, but invitations. And perhaps this is where the idea of Amaruca, the land of the plumed serpent, begins to shimmer with new light. For if these deities were seen across time and space in various names and forms, always bringing the same themes, balance, transformation, knowledge, then perhaps they were not isolated myths but fragments of a greater vision. One that saw the Americas not as empty wilderness, but as a sacred realm. A place where knowledge was preserved not in books but in symbols. Not in cathedrals but in landscapes. Not in hierarchies but in stars and breath. The serpent gods were not conquerors. They were guides. Their temples were calendars. Their myths were meditations. And their feathers still drift unseen across the memory of this land. Would you like me to continue with Section 3, where we will explore the Andean concept of Amaru, and the high-altitude philosophies that embrace the serpent as both earth spirit and cosmic transformer? High in the Andes, where the air thins and the earth leans into the heavens, memory lingers longer. In the silence of wind brushing across ancient stone, in the glint of gold hidden beneath green mountains, in the layered terraces of civilizations long gone, something speaks. It does not shout. It hums. And if one listens carefully, it sings of Amaru. To the Andean peoples, particularly the Inca and their predecessors, the serpent was not a symbol of temptation or sin. It was a keeper of wisdom, a guardian of thresholds. Amaru was the name given to this great serpent, and unlike its Mesoamerican cousins, it did not come from the sea or the stars. It came from the earth itself, coiling through roots, rivers, and even the underworld. Yet Amaru, like Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, had wings. It too was adorned with feathers. For while it moved through soil and water, it also soared. Amaru was sacred precisely because it united opposites. As in Mesoamerican cosmology, the Andes held a deep reverence for the union of the upper world, Hanan Pasha, the middle world, K Pasha, and the lower world, Uku Pasha. These were not heavens or hells in the Western sense, but interwoven planes of existence, each necessary, each alive. The serpent traversed them all. Amaru emerged from Uku Pasha, the inner realm. It tunneled through mythic times, surfacing not just in stories, but in the very architecture of Inca civilization. Temples like Coricancha in Cusco, the golden navel of the empire, honored cosmic forces with walls that mirrored the movement of constellations. Amaru was carved into stone lintels, woven into textiles, traced in the paths of sacred rivers and mountain trails. One could argue that the Andes themselves were imagined as the spine of Amaru. And the people? They did not walk upon the serpent, but with it. Unlike the fear-laden serpent stories of later Christian influence, Amaru was not something to banish or conquer. It was something to understand. It represented power, yes, but power in the form of transformation. In Quechua, the serpent was not just animal. It was energy, change, knowledge, the ability to renew. And as in the north, the serpent's appearance was often tied to beings of wisdom. Viracocha, the great Inca creator god, was not a serpent himself, but was accompanied by them. Described as a bearded figure who walked the earth teaching agriculture, morality, and peace, Viracocha is said to have emerged from Lake Titicaca in a time of chaos, bringing order with him. His serpents trailed behind, not as monsters but as companions. His departure, much like Quetzalcoatl's, was gentle. He walked west into the Pacific, promising to return. Some versions of the tale suggest that Amaru descended from the stars and taught humans how to align their cities with the heavens. The most sacred Inca structures, like the fortress of Sacsayhuaman or the city of Machu Picchu, do not merely sit atop mountains, they speak with them. Their stones, so precisely cut that no mortar was needed, follow curves and angles that mirror celestial alignments. And many of these forms, if seen from above, resemble serpents. A wall that coils, a stair that bends, a temple that loops. As if Amaru itself had been pressed into the land like a seal. Even in agricultural practices, the serpent played a role. Terraces were not only practical, they were spiritual. They allowed humans to grow food on mountainsides, yes, but they also mirrored the spiral and wave-like forms of Amaru. Farming became a ritual of continuity. To feed the body was to feed the spirit of the earth. To shape the land was to harmonize with it, not dominate it. And so, Amaru became both literal and symbolic. It was the curve of the river, the rise of the mountain, the shape of the Milky Way, the wisdom of the ancients. Among the Quechua and Aymara peoples, serpent dances were performed during solstice rituals. Children and elders moved in coils, mimicking the great creature's shape. Masks were worn, bright and feathered, adorned with gold and silver. Stories were sung, not read, and in these chants, Amaru was evoked not just as a creature but as a presence. A force that watched, that remembered. There are tales still told in the Andes of people disappearing into serpent caves. Not consumed but transformed. They re-emerge months or years later with eyes that seem deeper, voices that speak less and say more. Touched by Amaru, the elders say, these are not stories of fear but of reverence, of the belief that transformation, real soul-deep transformation, is never without risk but always a return. To those immersed in esoteric studies, Amaru becomes more than just a cultural god. It becomes a cipher, a symbolic key. The name Amaru, when traced etymologically, resonates with ancient Indo-European words for snake and spirit. The Sanskrit word naga, meaning serpent, is used in Indian and Tibetan traditions to describe guardian spirits of rivers, lakes, and hidden wisdom. In ancient Mesopotamia, Anzu was a feathered creature representing storms and divine knowledge. In Egypt, the cobra goddess Wadjet protected kings and was associated with the rising sun. Could it be that the serpent's wisdom was not merely a regional motif, but a global one? Could Amaru be part of a forgotten lineage, one that stretches across continents and millennia? Among the more esoteric theorists, including Manly P. Hall, Helena Blavatsky, and other 19th and 20th century mystics, such connections are not dismissed as fantasy but embraced as fragments of a lost spiritual tradition, one that held serpent wisdom at its core. In this reading, Amaru becomes not just an Andean deity, but an expression of a universal archetype. The teacher who emerges from within, who sheds skins, who tunnels through ignorance and rises in awakening. The serpent as spine, as kundalini, as energy rising up from base to crown. Within the context of Amaruca, the land of the plumed serpent, this makes even more sense. For here in the Andes, the serpent was not merely imagined. It was lived. It was carved into the bones of the landscape, inscribed into the movement of daily life. To walk through Inca territory was to walk through a living myth. In the early years of European colonization, these myths were suppressed. Christian missionaries reinterpreted the serpent as satanic, the underworld as hell, the indigenous cosmologies as pagan blasphemy. Temples were razed. Rituals were forbidden. And yet the serpent survived. It survived in art. In whispered stories passed down at night. In weavings, in music, in quiet gestures. In the stories grandmothers tell by the fire when the door is locked and the world has gone to sleep. Amaru was never just a god. It was a mirror. A challenge. It asked each generation the same question. What must be shed in order to grow? What coils in the soul waiting to awaken? Even now, among spiritual seekers and indigenous preservationists, the teachings of Amaru are being revived, not as museum pieces but as medicine. Retreats are held in the highlands. Pilgrimages trace serpent-shaped trails. Ceremonies call on the great energy once more. Not to worship but to remember. And in remembering something stirs. A whisper through stone. A shadow in the canyon. A shimmer on the lake. The serpent rises. Would you like me to continue with section 4, where we will explore how the idea of the land of the plumed serpent was distorted or erased by colonization, and how the name America may have been a buried echo of Amaruca? When the sails of Europe first appeared on the horizon of the Western world, they did not arrive empty. The ships that docked along Caribbean coasts and Andean ports carried not only soldiers, merchants, and priests, but also symbols. Symbols that would collide with those of the New World in ways that forever altered its spirit. Among the most enduring losses was silence. Not a sudden one, like the thunder of muskets or the clang of church bells raised upon toppled temples, but a creeping silence. Forgetting. A rewriting of maps, names, and meanings so total that even memory began to doubt itself. The serpent of wisdom, the plumed, the cosmic, the coiled, was among the first to be cast aside. In the hands of the Christian conquerors, serpents were not teachers or healers. They were seducers, demons, manifestations of evil. And so, with fervent purpose, missionaries set about removing serpent iconography wherever it was found. What had once graced temples, garments, and sacred paths was either buried or burned. Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, Gukyamats, Amaru, names whispered for generations with awe and reverence, were suddenly condemned. Their temples were transformed into cathedrals. Their stories were rewritten, their rituals outlawed, their believers threatened. In Peru, the great city of Cusco, once the golden capital of Toantinsuyo, became a stronghold of Spanish rule. In Mexico, Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza faded into ruin, their astronomical alignments left unstudied by the new faith. But some stories cannot be fully killed. And some symbols, despite suppression, hide in plain sight. Consider the name, America. The conventional origin, repeated in classrooms and textbooks across the globe, credits the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci. He was among the first Europeans to suggest that the lands discovered by Columbus were not part of Asia but a distinct continent. A German mapmaker, Martin Waldseemüller, published a world map in 1507 with the label America, sprawled across South America in Vespucci's honor. The name, it is said, simply stuck. Yet in the quiet circles of esoteric historians and metaphysical scholars, another possibility stirs. Manly P. Hull, writing in the 20th century, resurrected a shadow of memory that had long been buried. He pointed to Amaruca, a name whispered in pre-Columbian and Andean traditions. A name that meant land of the plumed serpent. He suggested that the continent's true spiritual identity had been erased, not just through military conquest but through nominal erasure. That in replacing Amaruca with America, the sacred was secularized, and the wisdom once woven into the land's name was made invisible. Some may scoff. Coincidence, they might say. Romanticism. Esoteric fiction. Perhaps. But there are strange convergences too compelling to ignore. In Quechua, the term Amaru not only refers to the serpent but also to wisdom hidden in nature. In the Maya language, Kukulkan also means the feathered serpent who comes from the sky. In the language of symbols, serpents often represent duality, earth and sky, body and spirit, death and rebirth. And then consider this. During the colonization of the Americas, many of the invading orders, particularly the Jesuits and Franciscans, were deeply versed in symbology. They knew how names mattered, how symbols encoded memory. To erase a name was not simply an administrative act. It was a ritual of disconnection. But the displacement of Amaruca was not only spiritual, it was political. Colonizers were building not only empires but myths. And in the myths of empire there could be no equal. No ancient wisdom to rival European Christendom. No serpent-born philosopher king like Quetzalcoatl. No feathered guide like Amaru who promised enlightenment without conquest. Instead, the narrative had to be rewritten. America was a blank canvas. A wild land made virtuous only by its European discovery. The indigenous peoples were rebranded as primitives, their histories as oral nonsense, their philosophies as pagan illusions. The spiritual authority of the land was to be replaced by the church, the crown, and the cross. And so the serpent was stripped of its feathers. Temples were leveled and stone blocks repurposed to build Spanish cathedrals. Priests learned native tongues not to preserve them, but to extinguish them with translations of the Bible. Festivals honoring solstices were rebranded as saints' days. Mountain gods became devils and cave spirits were cast as witches. Even the landscapes, once mapped in sacred geometries, were carved into grid patterns. But memory is tenacious. In remote Andean villages, the name Amaru continued to echo. In weaving patterns in children's songs. In hidden caves and whispered rituals. Not as open worship, but as a quiet remembering. In Mexico, modern depictions of Quetzalcoatl persisted in murals and folk tales. In Guatemala, the name Gucumatz lived on in sacred oral epics like the Popol Vuh. The plumed serpent remained, not in temples but in bones, blood, and dreams. And as centuries passed, the symbols began to rise again. By the 19th century, spiritual revivalists, Freemasons, and Rosicrucians began to notice something strange. That the land they called America bore signs of a spiritual inheritance older than Europe. They saw the serpent symbols in native rock art, the star alignments of ruined cities, the teachings hidden in coded myths. And they began to wonder, had the land itself always been sacred? Was its true name, Amaruca, silenced, not forgotten? The founding of the United States carries some of this energy. Many of its early architects, including Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, were immersed in Freemasonic and esoteric thought. The Great Seal of the United States features an all-seeing eye atop a pyramid, echoing symbols found in Egyptian and Andean cultures alike. Franklin even proposed a national motto, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," echoing the serpent's role as a breaker of chains, not as an agent of chaos but of transformation. If America did inherit the name Amaruca in secret, if its spiritual destiny was not to conquer but to remember, then perhaps the silence of the serpent is not a death but a coiling, a waiting. For silence too is sacred. It holds breath, keeps memory, Even now, spiritual seekers and indigenous wisdom keepers are reconnecting the broken threads. They walk the old trails. They read the glyphs anew. They sit with elders and ask questions that were once dangerous to speak aloud. And in doing so they find the serpent again, not in opposition to the divine but as a bridge toward it. In a world where noise is constant and memory is fleeting, the ancient serpent waits not in myth, but in the marrow of the land. It winds beneath modern highways and abandoned temples. It dreams in the shadows of skyscrapers. It whispers in the stars and coils in the roots of mountains. And sometimes it speaks, not in the loud voice of conquest, but in the still voice of truth. It is often said that history is written by the victors. But what is less often said, perhaps because it cannot be written in words, is that memory is kept by the earth. The stones, the rivers, the pathways carved by barefoot steps over centuries, they do not forget. They store stories the way trees hold rings, invisible to the hurried eye, but waiting patiently for the one who pauses, listens, and looks again. In the dream of America, long past the roar of conquistadors and the doctrine of empires, the plumed serpent continues to breathe. Not in loud temples or grand rituals, but in subtler places, beneath city streets, etched into forgotten art, and echoing through the bones of buildings that seem ordinary but are anything but. One only needs to tilt the lens of perception. In Mexico City, beneath the concrete and neon lights, lie the ruins of Tenochtitlan. The Aztec capital, once a city of canals and great pyramids, was constructed in sacred alignment with the cosmos. At its heart stood the Templo Mayor, where the serpent god Huitzilopochtli and his feathered counterpart Quetzalcoatl were honored. Though the Spaniards razed the temple, its stones were not carried far. They were used to build cathedrals that still stand today. Beneath those churches the old gods dream on. Walk the streets of Cusco, Peru, and look closely at the foundations of colonial buildings. The base stones, seamless and massive, bear the craftsmanship of the Inca. They are not ruins but roots. Roots of a serpent that still curls through the city's alleys and plazas. Tourists may pass unaware, but the locals sometimes glance down at the stones with a silent nod, as if greeting something older than language. Even in North America, echoes remain. In the serpent-shaped mounds of Ohio, created by the ancient Adena and Hopewell peoples long before the arrival of Europeans, the Great Serpent Mound, a quarter-mile in length, coils through the grass like a memory that refuses to vanish. Its head aligns with the summer solstice. Its body curves with the lunar calendar. It is a map not only of time but of transformation. What were these mounds if not messages? Not of conquest or dominance, but of watching, knowing, becoming. The serpent here was not only worshipped. It was traced into the earth as a cosmic guide, a marker of balance between heaven and soil. These lingering symbols call to something deep within the human psyche. The serpent, cross-cultural and eternal, is not merely a religious image. It is an archetype. In Indian yoga, the Kundalini serpent coils at the base of the spine, waiting to rise. In African traditions such as the Dahomey and Yoruba, serpent spirits guard gateways and secrets. In Norse mythology, the world serpent Jormungandr circles the earth, connecting beginning and end. Perhaps the plumed serpent of the Americas was never just a god. It was an embodiment of the knowledge that wisdom is cyclical, that destruction leads to rebirth, that forgetting invites remembering. In this view, the silence placed over the serpent was not an end, but a coiling, a gestation. And now the serpent stirs. In the 21st century, seekers from around the globe are turning again to indigenous philosophies, not to appropriate but to remember. To sit at the feet of those who still remember what it means to walk with the land rather than upon it. Shamans, elders, and storytellers, once silenced, are being invited again to speak. And when they do, the serpent is there in the room, though it makes no sound. Architects draw inspiration from sacred geometry once more. Artists integrate serpent forms into murals and textile design. In music festivals, spiritual retreats, and alternative education spaces, the feathered serpent returns not as a dogma, but as a whisper. A guide toward harmony, balance, and awakening. Even the resurgence of interest in the esoteric traditions of Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism has led many to revisit the America's spiritual foundation. Symbols such as the pine cone, the spiral, the double-headed serpent, once buried in secrecy, are again discussed as living metaphors. And in language too, the serpent reemerges. Amaruca is spoken in soft tones in sacred ceremonies. It appears in poems, in dreams, in the naming of spiritual centers. It may not yet return to maps, but it reclaims its place in the imagination. This is the hidden soul of America. Not the nation-state, not the borderlines drawn in ink, but the living continent, vast and ancient, that was once, and perhaps still is, the land of the plumed serpent. To walk upon it is to walk on stories. Some might ask, why does this matter now? Why unearth forgotten myths and give breath to ancient names? Because we are once again at a threshold. The modern world trembles with uncertainty. Climate shifts, spiritual disconnection, cultural amnesia. All signs that something is unraveling. And yet, in these moments, ancient wisdom often returns. Not to impose but to guide. The serpent does not shout. It coils slowly, waiting for stillness. Its wisdom is not in answers but in movement. In the ability to shed, to adapt, to rise. Perhaps that is why the plumed serpent was feathered. To remind us that what comes from the ground may also take flight. That what burrows deep may also ascend. In that sense, Amaruca was never lost. It waits in the bloodlines of those who remember. In the dreams of those who listen. In the silent geometry of landscapes still whispering sacred songs. The feathered serpent continues its journey, not as a figure of worship, but as a companion of awakening. It is said that when the world begins to forget itself, the old spirits rise, not in wrath but in remembrance. And somewhere beneath the skin of the earth, a winged shape shifts in the dark. Not to strike, not to flee, but to rise. Even as cities rise and technology advances, there remains a persistent thread, quiet, resilient, and sacred, woven into the very soil of the American continents. This thread is not etched in modern blueprints or written in official histories. Rather, it exists in the mythic memory that still breathes beneath the ground, coiled like a serpent resting between dreams. The story of Amaruca, or the land of the plumed serpent, though often dismissed as esoteric speculation, continues to whisper to those who listen carefully. Long before the name America came to be associated with states and borders, it may have signified something far older, an idea rooted in transformation, sacred knowledge, and harmony with cosmic rhythms. The plumed serpent was not merely a deity. It was a concept, a movement, a breathing symbol that lived in both the heavens and the earth. One cannot overstate the importance of this serpent figure in pre-Columbian cosmology. Across vast distances and divergent cultures, It appears again and again, sometimes under different names, but always bearing similar themes. In the Yucatan Peninsula, the Maya worshipped Kukulkan. In central Mexico, the Aztecs revered Quetzalcoatl. In the Quiche traditions, Gucumats played the role of the wise creator. In the Andes, the Inca spoke of Amaru and Viracocha, beings of immense knowledge and power, often taking serpentine or feathered forms. This synchronicity among civilizations who had little direct contact suggests a shared spiritual lexicon. The serpent, often maligned in later Western theology, was in these traditions a teacher, a messenger, and a connector between worlds. It lived in the sky as a bird and in the earth as a snake. It was both the seen and the unseen, the earthly and the celestial. It represented the duality and unity of the universe itself. Even the name Amaruca, said to mean land of the plumed serpent, carries a certain poetic weight. While etymological scholars may challenge its linguistic authenticity, its resonance remains powerful. Manly P. Hall, the philosopher and mystic who helped reintroduce the idea in the early 20th century, believed that the continent was a cradle for a new spiritual awakening. Not because it was new, but because it was ancient, older than remembered, and thus ready to be remembered anew. As time flowed forward, this sacred memory was layered over with conquest and doctrine. The colonial project sought to suppress indigenous cosmologies and replace them with imported creeds. Churches were built atop pyramids. Rituals were banned. Languages were silenced. And yet the serpent survived. It slipped between the cracks of empire, hiding in weavings, in petroglyphs, in the hushed prayers of the elders. In the American Southwest, Puebloan tribes still perform dances in which serpents feature prominently, not as omens of fear but as sacred guides. Among the Hopi, the snake dance is a powerful ritual meant to bring rain and balance. To the Zuni, the serpent is a protector. These traditions did not vanish. They adapted, moved underground, and quietly endured. One might wonder, how did such a unified mythos survive through such turmoil? The answer may lie in the nature of the serpent itself. Unlike gods of war or conquest, the serpent does not seek control. It watches, waits, and moves when the moment is right. It does not speak in declarations but in symbols, dreams, and natural patterns. Its endurance is not due to force but to wisdom. And now, in our own time, this wisdom begins to surface once more. In recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in indigenous wisdom traditions, not out of romanticism but out of necessity. As the modern world grapples with ecological collapse, spiritual emptiness, and cultural fragmentation, many seek the threads that once held life in balance. And often those threads lead back to the serpent. Spiritual centers across the Americas now incorporate indigenous teachings with respect and reverence. In places like Lake Atitlan in Guatemala or the Sacred Valley in Peru, healers speak openly of Amaru not as myth but as reality, a force that still shapes the rhythms of earth and sky. In universities, scholars revisit the Nahuatl and Quechua languages, not only to preserve them, but to understand the philosophies encoded within them. Even architecture reflects this quiet reawakening. Some eco-villages and biophilic design communities intentionally align their spaces with the natural contours of the land, echoing ancient principles of harmony. The plumed serpent in this context is not carved in stone. It is embedded in the layout of homes, the placement of gardens, the flow of water systems. It is lived. There are symbols too in modern state and national iconography that nod, perhaps unknowingly, to this deeper lineage. The eagle devouring the serpent in the Mexican flag, often interpreted as a symbol of conquest, could also be read as a meeting of sky and earth. In the seal of the United States, Masonic symbols such as the unfinished pyramid and the all-seeing eye have drawn the curiosity of many. Could these be remnants of an older philosophical understanding? Echoes of Amaruca's sacred geometry? The idea may sound far-fetched to some, but history, especially the symbolic kind, is not a chain of dates. It is a tapestry of meaning. And the deeper one looks, the more clearly the serpent winds through the threads. This is not to say that all who live on this continent are bound to one myth. Rather, the serpent offers a lens, a way of seeing the land not as a commodity but as a living being. It invites reflection. Where have we come from? What knowledge have we buried? What wisdom still lies beneath our feet, coiled and waiting? Perhaps Amaruca was never meant to be a place on a map, but a way of seeing the world. A mode of consciousness in which the sacred is not confined to temples or texts but is found in rain patterns, in the migration of birds, in the slow growth of moss upon stone. In this vision, America was not named for a man but for a mystery, a whisper carried by wind and feather and fong, a name spoken by rivers before any flag was planted. And if the serpent is indeed rising again, not to conquer but to remind, then perhaps there is still time. Time to uncoil from the haste of industrial progress. Time to reconnect with what has been lost. Time to remember that stories like serpents do not end, they transform. So when the sun sets on the highlands of Peru, and the moon rises over the temples of Chichen Itza, when the stars spin above the Serpent Mound in Ohio, perhaps something ancient stirs. Not in fear, not in anger, but in awakening. And in that stillness, if one listens closely, not with ears but with the soul, one might hear it. The breath of the plumed serpent, the voice of the land, a memory older than memory, rising,